Welcome, everyone. Thanks for attending. This session is entitled Creating SharePoint 2013 Workflows. This is code IW402, and it's being presented by my esteemed colleague, Penny Coventry, and I'm Mike Fitzmaurice, and it is part of a three-part story. Some of you did not attend our previous session, which was all about, as awesome as the new workflow platform is, it doesn't do everything the old one did. The old one's still there, and there are situations where you'll still want to use it. That's okay. It was recorded. It'll be on the DVDs. And if you want to ask us about it, we can talk about it even before you get the DVDs. We're here to talk about the new model workflows in this session, and in the next session after lunch, we will talk about a great example of taking full advantage of the new workflow paradigm to make what was an arduous task process much, much simpler. My name is Mike Fitzmaurice. I am the Vice President of Product Technology for a company called Nintex. We're an exhibitor here. If you're interested in Nintex, go visit our booth. I'll be there later, but we're not talking about Nintex. I'm here because I know something about workflow and something about SharePoint. We're talking strictly about pure SharePoint stuff. I've spent the last 5 years at Nintex. Prior to that, I spent 11 years at Microsoft, and most of that time was on the SharePoint team. My involvement with SharePoint actually predates it being called SharePoint. So, been at this all. In fact, I was the original technical evangelist for SharePoint. There was a time when we had to knock on doors and beg people to pay attention to us and care. SharePoint used to be the scrappy underdog. Things have changed a lot, and the very first SharePoint conference of any sort had 175 people in attendance, worldwide. Crazy, crazy stuff. It's a good thing. And Penny.
Hi, I'm Penny Coventry. I'm based in the UK. I'm an independent consultant. I also write a number of books. I've co-authored or authored in excess of 10 books now. I've been working with SharePoint now for over 10 years, and I'm also a trainer. So that's me.
Excellent. And I believe
it's
at
over
this
to me.
point, it's all you.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about the SharePoint 2013 workflow. In our previous session, we explained that there are two types of workflow in SharePoint 2013. So if you install SharePoint 2013, you've got two types of workflows. You've got the SharePoint 2010 workflows, where it is exactly the same as you had in SharePoint 2010. Okay? So you can build the same types of workflows. And we're calling that the classic model, okay? And then we've got a new workflow, which you can build, which is a SharePoint 2013 workflow. And the difference between the two is that the SharePoint 2010 workflows, just like in the previous version, will be executing within SharePoint. The SharePoint 2013 workflows will be working inside a separate piece of software called the Workflow Manager. You can install that separate piece of software on the same servers as SharePoint Server, or you can install it on separate servers. Of course, if you're going to use workflows a lot, or in production, then you would be installing it on separate servers. But that's all sort of IT pro sort of things. But the main thing to realize is that you now have got two workflow engines. One of them, the one that's inbuilt in SharePoint, is based on the Workflow Foundation 3.5. Whereas the workflows that are working within this Workflow Manager is based on the Workflow Foundation 4.5. Okay, so you've got two different technologies that we've got to now cater for in SharePoint 2013. So we talked in the previous session about the issues that we might have. So the issues with SharePoint 2010 was well, not issues, but, you know, sort of like the underlying focus or strategy of SharePoint 2010 was that it was more or less always installed on premise. Okay? If you needed to build any SharePoint 2010 workflows using Visual Designer, for example, then the likelihood is that your developers would be installing some software on top inside the servers, okay? Which isn't the way you want to go, or Microsoft aren't allow you going to go that way if you are purchasing from them one of the plans in Office 365. They're not going to allow you to do that, okay? Also in SharePoint 2010, there was a limited amount of scaling you could do in your servers as far as your workflow component was involved. There was no separation of it like other services in SharePoint. If you were getting performance problems, you just couldn't install another server and say, oh, let's have that server just concentrating on workflow. It would be taking on your web requests or your other parts of SharePoint. So you could do some tweaks, but there was a little bit a limit of your scaling. In 2013, Microsoft has recreated this the Workflow Manager so that we've got this different type of workflows now running in this separate product, and that's so that Microsoft itself could scale things out when they're supporting the infrastructure for Office 365. Okay. It also means we can actually communicate using standard protocols. And we can, as I say, have better scaling capabilities. So how do we build workflows today if you've got SharePoint Server 2013? Exactly the same way as before. Okay, no difference. You'll be able to use the same skills that you used before to use SharePoint Designer workflows. So we have got a new version of SharePoint Designer that knows about the new version of workflow. Okay? And we're going to see that in the demo that follows. If you're going to build them yourself, then you're going to use Visual Studio. We're not going to be talking about the development perspective here. This is the information worker track. But Andrew Connell has a session if you are a developer and you wish to look at how to develop them. So yes, we can have both types of workflow now in SharePoint Designer, okay, and in the browser as well. Oops. So the 2013 workflows, the new things that you haven't seen before, okay, will be loops. In the previous session, we talked through a particular scenario about a change request process, and we were saying, yes, in an ideal world, yes, all your change requests would actually get through the technical review, pop out of that, pop into the change control board, pop out of that, and you would be given the permissions to implement your change. Okay? But of course, life isn't easy, isn't simple like that. It's not serial in nature. You sometimes have to go back. Your technical reviewer will have to say, I need some additional information. Okay? And then you need to pop back in and get the technical reviewer to look at the additional information that you've provided. Okay? Well, in SharePoint 2010, because we didn't have any loop backs, we had to implement a couple of workflows to do that one business process. However, in SharePoint 2013 now, we can loop. So our workflows are actually going to be much better, much more readable for the users. Before, we had to monitor what was going on by columns, and those columns could be very confusing to the user. And there was no definitive page that would allow you to say, so how many times have we been round the loop? You would again have to try and engineer that sort of answer some other means. Okay. We've also got an app-only step. In the SharePoint 2010, we had something called an impersonation step. Now that meant within the impersonation step, you could put actions, and those actions would then be executed as the person who designed the workflow, the person who created the workflow on the document library or the list. Okay? So the creator of the workflow. And so if you wanted your workflow to write away to a list or library, and the person who initiated the workflow didn't have the permissions of that, then that's when you would use an impersonation step. Okay? Now, in SharePoint 2013 workflows, you haven't got the impersonation step. But what you've got is something called an app-only step. Now this is a site feature, and you can turn it on at the site level, and therefore your SharePoint Designer workflows can then use this new action, this a new step. And this means that within this step, the workflow instance has full control of your site. So they can write away to your lists or libraries or whatever you like, even though the initiator doesn't. So we've got rid of one sort of thing from SharePoint 2010 workflows, but we've got a new thing in SharePoint 2013. And that is the case in many of the things. You will see some actions that are not there in your SharePoint 2013 workflows that you would have expected. Right? That may be that they're not there, full stop. Sometimes it will mean you'll just have to look for different terminology to actually do the same sort of things. Now, we did have parallel blocks in SharePoint 2010. We still have them in 2013 workflows, but we've got an additional capability of shortcutting and getting out of that parallel block, which we didn't have in 2010 workflows. Now, in SharePoint 2010, we did have steps. And in my previous session, I did say I always use steps as a means of documenting what's happening and the way of grouping together actions that implement a particular task that I'm trying to do within my workflow. We did have a look at the start approval process, and we did see in some of those sub-processes, we did have something called stages. Okay? So in the task part of that process, we didn't pop from one step to the another automatically. We had to wait for a particular state in chain, a particular change in state, before a particular block would execute. Okay? Now, in SharePoint Designer, we couldn't create those blocks ourselves, those stages. As I said, if you created a state approval process, you got them for free. Okay? Your developers could, however, create a stage workflow, a state workflow. Now, in SharePoint Designer, we can create a state workflow, and that is the subject of our third presentation. Okay. We've got some additional actions. I said we've got some that some actions you won't see in SharePoint 2013. We've got some additional ones. So, for example, we can start a list workflow. We can start a site workflow. We can actually jump from one stage to another. So we can organize our workflows slightly different. We can also call an HTTP web service. So if we can't actually do it ourselves, but we can get something else to do it on our behalf, then we can actually call it. And this was, again, one of the things that Microsoft heard from loads and loads of customers that they actually wanted from a workflow. Now, the start approval task actions that you might be used to in SharePoint 2010 are not there in SharePoint 2013. But that doesn't mean you can't start task-like actions. So in SharePoint 2010, there's about 6 task-related actions. In SharePoint 2013, there is just one. Okay? And again, we're going to be talking about that in our last section. Okay. We have got some new variable types. Okay? So one of the most important ones is a dictionary. Okay? So this allows us to keep almost like rows in a table. Okay? Many times when we're actually getting information back from other things, it might be that we're saying, right, yes, please give me the value in a column in the current item, or please go to that list and give me the back of the value in the current item, or please go to the user profile and tell me who the person's manager is. In many cases, we only want one piece of information. But what we can do now with a dictionary is say, not only, we don't just want one piece of information, we want several pieces of information about a person, perhaps. And perhaps we don't just want one person, we want multiple people and all the same sort of properties. Okay? So what we've got in SharePoint 2013 to take account of that type of scenario is this, what they're calling a dictionary. Okay? and so we can actually pull off information about that. Now this is really, really useful when you tie it up with the web services action, because in many cases when you're calling a web service, you're going to get multiple pieces of information back. You're then going to want to pass through that information and do different things with that information. You don't want to keep on calling that web service for the odd bit of information, because that is poor performance. Your workflow is going to have to sit on its hands while your SharePoint engine is going to have to go over the internet to somebody else's server to get that information. So this way, we can go over the internet once, get all the information we want, save it in a variable, and getting information from the variable is the fastest way of getting information out. So this is really, really good. So we can do things like we can say, right, how many items did get sent back to us, and that means that we can use the new looping capability in SharePoint Designer to actually loop through every single item that has been returned to us, and we can get that item from the dictionary. So that is really useful then.
Spacebar will do it.
Oh. I have so much memory, or things in my memory, that things keep on popping out as another one goes in. I need a RAM upgrade, I really do. Now, this is one of the things you'd really, really love, okay? You can cut and paste, all right? How often have you got the actions in the wrong place, yes? And you can move them up and you can move them down, but then you suddenly can't move them from one step to another. All right? Or you've created it as a list workflow and you've decided you wanted it as a library workflow in a library, or you wanted it as a site workflow, or you created a site workflow or whatever. You can now cut and paste to your heart's content, and it will use all the same sort of keywords that you're used to in Word. You know, Control C, Control V, Control A to select all your steps or whatever, and then Control V to paste it in somewhere else. You can even paste it into Word or Outlook, so you can quickly create your own documentation. Okay. Now, of course, it's not going to contain all the information, because when you're seeing a workflow in task in the text-based view, then some of the things you've filled in, you only get ... sort of thing. But if you paste it into another workflow, all your variables and stuff will come out. But in Word, it doesn't show you all the information. So yes, you can do it. Again, Microsoft will always provide you with multiple ways of doing the same thing. So we are going to see commands, new commands on the ribbon, on the workflow ribbon, to able us to cut and paste. And of course, we've got what I call the list item menu, or what developers call the edit control block, you know, this sort of context-sensitive menu with new items on it. Now, if you were in the previous session, you would have heard that Mike talked about that in a SharePoint 2013 workflow, you can't create a reusable workflow. A reusable workflow in 2010 means that you can create a workflow that you can say is based on all content types or on a specific content type. So it's almost like you're creating a workflow template, and then you can assign that workflow template or add that workflow template on a list or library. Okay? In your SharePoint 2013 workflows, you can't create reusable workflows. You can only create site lists workflows. Okay? So you might say, how can we package it up? Because that was the one great thing about reusable workflows, is you could package them up as a WSP file and then take them from one site collection to another site collection, or enable them on one site and disable them on another site, okay? Or make them a globally reusable workflow. But you can now package up your lists and your site workflows, so you will be able to get your WSP workflows and you can take them from one site to another. So that's a good thing. We would have cried there if we didn't have that as well. What we've got new if you are creating your SharePoint 2013 workflows is, yes, we've got the text-based way of configuring and adding actions and conditions. And you may have in 2010 opened up Visio and designed your workflow in Visio. and then imported it into SharePoint Designer, and then configured all the actions and conditions. In this next version of SharePoint, if you've bought the Visio 2003 Professional Edition, you will be able to mimic the same sort of experience in 2010, but you can also have that same kind of design surface within SharePoint Designer if you've installed Visio Premier on your desktop. So underneath the covers SharePoint Designer, even though you're presenting your diagrams as a Visio diagram, it is using the Visio engine underneath it, but at least you're all in one product. You can also, in your Visio view, as I say, this is only for SharePoint 2013 workflows, so in your Visio view, you can actually configure your conditions and actions, okay? So you don't have to keep on flipping between your Visio design surface and your text-based design surface, if that's what you like. Now, in Visio 2013, Microsoft has brought Visio to the world that Excel and Word and whatever has known since 2007. So in Word 2007, they introduced a new file format to Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, which adhered to the open something, wasn't it? I can't remember. Yes. See, another one popped out, you see. So we had this new extension with an X, on the end. So PPTX, DocX, XSLX. So now we have this new extension in Visio. This means that the way of exporting out a Visio diagram from Visio and importing it into SharePoint Designer is slightly different because we are going to be using these new file formats. Okay, so that's the reference there. So let's get on with the demo. So here I am in the browser. I've opened up a particular document library or list, and I've gone to the workflow settings page. Okay, and immediately in SharePoint 2013, you can see that I've got two section headings. I've got a section heading called SharePoint 2013 Workflows, and I've got a section heading labeled SharePoint 2010. So we can, in SharePoint 2013, run both SharePoint 2010 workflows and SharePoint 2013 workflows. I have on this particular document library already associated with this document library 3 workflow templates, okay? And they all happen to be SharePoint 2010 workflows. If I want to add another workflow template here, just like in 2010, the interface hasn't changed that much. So I click Add a Workflow, and it's going to take me to the workflow page. And I've got 2 working on it. So it must be doing it really fast. No, I don't know why it's showing 2 of them. It should only be showing 1. Yeah, no, I don't know why. The other terminology you'll see in SharePoint 2013 is it's supposed to be a lot nicer. I'm working on it. Hold on a minute, you know. Perhaps if I refresh it. I should have clicked it while I was talking about it. I don't know why it's gone all slow. I'll come back to that. Okay. Right, so if I'm in SharePoint Designer, just like before, I can create a list or a site or a reusable workflow. However, it's not until I try to create a workflow will I be asked what type of workflow do you want to create. Do you want to create a SharePoint 2010 workflow or a SharePoint 2013 workflow? Okay. So I'm going to create a 2013 workflow. Okay. So you're immediately taken to the text-based view of your workflow. But as I said, if you've got Visio installed, you can see a visual design. You can switch your workflow to a visual design representation of it. And underneath the covers, SharePoint Designer is talking to Visio and saying, look, here are all the components. Please show me a Visio representation of my workflow that I can actually configure within SharePoint Designer. Okay. So it will go through that process every time you switch from the text space design area to the visual workflow area. Okay. As you can see, we've still got the Start button. It just looks a little bit different. We've got what Microsoft called the clean sort of look to the next version of our products, but it's all sort of the same. And we've got things that we'd expect in Visio, so we've got the shape panel, so all these same sort of experience that you get there, so you can drag and drop them across or whatever. So I've got a workflow here. This workflow is going to show you an example of calling a web service and also using the dictionary. Okay. Now, what I'm going to show you here, so I don't know if any of you have been using the SharePoint 2013, but there is a new list type called the promoted links or promoted list. Yes, I don't know if you've been playing with it. And as you put items in there, then there's a view that will show you the information as tiles. Okay. So I've created a new list, and in it I've pointed it to a picture and some information, some description. And as you hover over the icon, you get the description coming up over the top. Yes? Okay, I don't know if you've played with that, but that's lovely, something to play around with. So I've created the same sort of thing here for weather. Okay. So I've got information about the weather that's coming up over the next 5 days for Brussels. Okay. So it's telling me today, the date, and it's telling me the information. And it's all part of a list. So it's the weather list. As I say, I've got the default view as the tile view. And if I switch to the all promoted links view, it will show me it as you might expect as the all items view. So all I've done is fill in information that it's asked me to, and the default view is to show it as a tile operation. Now, of course, I could go and I could type all this in. Okay, but what would be nice is to get these items in this list filled in by going over the internet and pulling that information from a company whose main business is weather. Okay. So I'm going to use a web service because a lot of people are actually exposing their information through web services. SharePoint itself exposes its information through web services. Okay? And if you want to get into this, you are going towards being a developer. Okay? Some web services are easier to interpret than others. Okay? So this one here is quite easy to interpret. And you can go to the site and you can ask for information and it will bring it back. And the format that you've going to have to ask for it back, and this was our reference on our slides to REST and JSON sort of thing, is to bring it back in this new sort of format called JSON. Now you can start your browser to bring back this information. Unfortunately, Internet Explorer is not very friendly with this. However, the Chrome is. So you can put a reference. So I'm going to this site called World Weather Online, and I'm asking for information about London. Okay, and I'm asking for it to give me the next 5 days worth of information. Okay, and that's what it's sending me back. Okay. Again, even Chrome is not very nice at actually presenting that data. And again, there's several tools that you'll find on the internet. And this one is a free tool called the JSON Viewer. Sorry. And what I've done is from the browser, the Chrome here. So if I deleted that, so if I delete all that content, Control-A, delete. And I then went to Chrome and copied all that. And I put it into my JSON viewer and then said, please format it. So it's almost like in SharePoint Designer, you could ask it to format as XML. And if you're used to the detailed, data source details task pane, that's what, in SharePoint Designer, that's what it was doing on your behalf. But SharePoint Designer hasn't been enhanced to show us it for JSON. So that's why I've had to use a third party. So if we look down here, you can see the information it's passing back to us is what is the current condition. But what we're really interested in is this part down here. And so for every day, I've got an entry, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, because we start counting at 0. And it's telling us the date of 0, 1, which is today. Okay? And it's telling us how much we're going to get in rain. It's not going to rain today, okay, in London. Okay? We can see the maximum temperature is 16, which is really unheard about, you know. And we can also see, if we go down into the weather description part, it's going to be a part cloudy. So I want to get this information from the web service, and then I want to create items in my list. So let me go back to my virtual machines. And let's open up SharePoint Designer. As you know, a big thing of using steps as a way of blocking off bits of information. So I always usually start my workflows with initializing my variables. So I've initialized it to say which location I want to try and find the information for. I've also set up a variable which has got the web address to this web service where I'm going to get all the weather from. So this is the web address that I put into the Chrome browser. Okay. I could also, what I was also thinking was I could also do the same for Bing, but I didn't go that far. So once I've done my initializing variables, I now want to get on with the job. And so I want to go to the next stage. Okay. And every single stage in SharePoint 2013 has a bit of an area at the bottom called the transition to stage. So that's where I can say which stage I want to jump to. I actually want to jump to the next one, okay, but it doesn't do it automatically. We have to tell it to jump to the next one. And when you click that, you will be provided with a list of stages you've got in your workflow that you can jump to. So I want to get information from the web service. So I use a new action called get. There it is. Can't see it. I was expecting it at the top because I've used it. Oh, there it is. Oh, call web service. Okay. All right. So there is the call web service. So you have to specify which is the web address that you're going to get the information from and what type it is. Well, I'm going to get information, so that's it. Okay. Now, this action can be quite complicated. If it's a simple web service call, then all you need to care about is when you call it, you want to care about what you're getting back. And also you get back a response code. Okay? So it's always good to see, if the response code is okay. Okay? Because then you could decide to do something else, like not try and save stuff into the list. Okay? So in a simple one, all you're caring about is the response you're getting back, your response content. Okay. So if we come up here, so I can delete that one. So I can hit just delete and it deletes it. So here is my call here. So you can see here I'm just calling the variable, which is the variable that I uploaded the web address. And I've said, please put all the stuff back into the WS response dictionary, because I'm going to get more than one line of code. I'm going to get a line of code, if you'd like to think about it, or a lump of information per day. Okay? And each day is going to have the same sort of information. So that's going to allow me to use the loop capability. So I'm going to use, so there's two types of loops. There's a loop n times and there's a loop, loop. There's a loop n times and a loop with condition. Okay? So I'm going to use the loop n times because I'm going to loop around this piece of code 5 times. Okay? And I need the index to start from 0 because I had a look at my data and the data was 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So even though I wanted to go around it 5 times, I wanted the first reference in it to be 0. So that's how you need to know your data, right? Nothing happens by magic if you don't know your data. So I set an index variable to 0, and then within the loop, I say that I want to go around 5 times. Okay? And I've also given a name to this loop, again for documentation purposes, so I know what it's going to achieve. So for each value in that JSON viewer, so for the 0 bucket or container, I'm going to have to pick off the weather or whatever. So again, looking at that, I know it was underneath the 0 container, there was a date container, and then there was a weather container, and then I had to say what I needed to implement. Okay. So everything piece of data I get, I need to pass through it, and then I'm going to store it into a variable. Okay. So I need to get that. So I'm sort of like, it's almost like XPath or something like that. If you've done that, you need to use that language to actually transverse down the information that's being provided to you. So I'm going to store it in a variable. So I go down and pick off the information I want to get from that web service, and I put each of those pieces of information into a variable. Now I do want this to be in a list, as a list item in that list, but I'm not going to store it as soon as I get it into the list because that's poor performance. Right? It's much better to use once the update item action, which is exactly the same as in SharePoint 2010, that you can actually say, yes, please update an item in this particular list. Here are the columns in the list I want to update, and I want to match it with the contents of the variable, and then I say which item in the list I do want to change. Because I've got them in the list, in that promoted links list, in day order. So I want to update the one that is in order first, okay? So that I get today, tomorrow, the next day, coming up in that order. So I need to just match on that. So then I have to increment my index so that I can pick off the next date and pick off the weather and then again store it. Okay? So what I can do, I can go into the browser. On this particular page, I can then update or start the workflow happening, and I can actually get the workflow to update itself and bring in, London or whatever. Okay. So that's my web service demo and the use of dictionary done.
Outstanding. Well, let's flip back over to the slides for just a moment. Let's try that again. And there we go.
All right.
There we go. Excellent, excellent. All right, everyone. So, in the time we have left, which is about 20 minutes, I'm going to do a demo and run you through what's the catch. There is a catch. I love the new workflow model. I love the workflow manager in a big, 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 big way. But don't think it's a superset of what you've gotten used to. In fact, who here has done workflows in SharePoint 2010? Any way, shape, or form. Don't really care how. Great. You're going to miss some stuff as you make the transition to the new paradigm. First off, task actions. If you got used to there being different kinds of tasks, like to-do items, or collecting data from users, or assigning a form to a group, or anything like that, that's all gone. There is exactly one kind of task in 2013, and if you want task flexibility, well, you're going to have to think about doing it a new way. And we'll actually cover that in the next session after lunch. But suffice to say, if you just want to say, give me data from users, or assign this to-do task to someone else, It's not that easy anymore. And if you want that, there are options, including doing it old school. Advanced task actions, like the in-the-box stuff that you could open and edit in SharePoint Designer and treat as sub-processes. That's not there. There are a few other things that are similar but completely different and not on the face as flexible. Do you manipulate or work with document sets or records or anything like that? There were activities in the 2010, and are still packaged if you're designing a 2010 style workflow in 2013, a whole library or a whole set of activities for manipulating document sets. Not present in the 2013 environment. If you want to manipulate permissions on items during a workflow, the activities for that have not been implemented in 2013. You want to visualize the progress of a workflow in Visio services? Not present. That only works on 2010 style workflows. And there are miscellaneous other fun things like associating a workflow with a content type. Templates. Being able to look up who a user's manager is with one quick step. Declaring something as a record or undeclaring it. Manipulating the content approval status. Waiting for a field to change in the current item, or checking to see if a field in an item equals a value as opposed to fetching it in advance and then making a comparison. If you want to impersonate the designer of the workflow, the new way of app permissions is great, but you're pretty much jumping from the intersection, not the union, the intersection of the app, the workflow's permissions, and the instance, the instantiator's permissions, the person starting the workflow. Normally, the workflow runs as the intersection of their privileges. If you turn a feature on a site, you can have it operate only under the app's privileges, which are actually quite substantial. The app's allowed to touch pretty much anything on the site. So if the site owner is okay with workflows asserting godhood, you can have godlike privileges. But there's no interim step where, okay, it's not the user or God, it's the user or the designer. It's different. .NET 4.5 and .NET 3.5 are very, very different, at least when it comes to workflow. It's not a compatible paradigm. It's different. Long run, it's better, but there's a lot of short-term to medium-term pain in making the transition if you're transitioning. InfoPath support. If you wanted to use InfoPath forms for task forms, for workflow startup forms, or workflow association, association forms, that's not possible. ASP.NET pages are generated for that, but you need an ASP.NET editor in order to do that. So the platform got better, but the bar got raised in terms of the amount of work you have to do to create a solution in the 2013 workflow paradigm. You can mitigate the feature gap. There are two strategies for doing this. Technique number one, use call web service and get really familiar with the REST API exposed by SharePoint. There are REST web services that help you manipulate permissions, that allow you to declare something as a record. Some of the things that there aren't quick drag and or point and click activities for, there are web services you can call that will do that work. And if you know the REST API, you can call it and mitigate the feature gap that way. And if you're interested in that, Eric Schupps is doing a talk tomorrow, I think, around this time or so. It's the talk right before lunch on the REST API. But again, we're getting into developer grade information here. Some of you are developers or play ones on TV, and great, but it's an information worker track session, so we are assuming that you don't require developer grade knowledge in order to do this kind of work. So what I'm going to talk about is strategy number two, which is they added the ability to allow a workflow to call another workflow and run it. And they can wait for it to finish or not. Now, the weird thing is a 2013 workflow can't call another 2013 workflow, but it can call a 2010 workflow. And since we're talking about a feature gap, here's how we plug that feature gap. Let's go into demo land, and let me get my demo environment up here. I have a nondescript document library, and I'm going to make 2 workflows here. What I want to be able to do is declare any document I want as an in-place record. And you'll know that it's been done if there is a nice little lock icon next to it, which is not present right now, nor should it be. Now, what I'm going to do here is, let's see, I'm in the document library. Great. Let's have at it. I want to come over here to the icon that represents workflow, and let's create a brand new workflow. Now, first thing we're going to do is create the 2010 style workflow. SharePoint Designer can do both. And we're going to call this declare current document as record. I'm illustrating a concept, not a full-blown end-to-end solution, so this is going to be a really simple workflow. Let's go here to action, and I've used it recently, so here it is, declare record. And it has no parameters and nothing fussy or fancy involved. In fact, the workflow itself doesn't require any parameters. I am free to just publish this and have a nice life. Publish. Publish like the wind. Thank you. We're out of here. Now, yes, I could have stayed in there and created my second workflow, but let's assume someone did that workflow a while back. Now we're going to make our own workflow that is designed to handle approving the declaration of a record. So record approval. We want to route this around, and if someone says it's okay to make it a record, then we'll make it a record automatically. And the approval bit, we're going to do new school instead of old school. So here, we're going to, let's see, go to actions, and I want to assign a task to somebody. And because I am doing a demo, I'm going to take liberties and force it to be a particular user. And here under task title, let's get slightly fancy. How about we say approve record declaration for, and then we add or change. I need, let's see. We can use the title or we can use the name of the document. I'm just going to use the name. Done. Not much else to do other than I'm going to wait for the task to complete. Yes, I could send out an email and so on, but that stuff's not so important here. I will be conscientiously making sure that happens, but I can also send overdue emails and such. That's kind of fun. Whoops, I didn't finish everything. So let's go ahead and finish configuring this. Under outcome options, we're assigning, this is a content type of workflow task. If you want custom tasks, you have to create custom content types. We'll actually do that after lunch. The outcome field, it's a built-in one called task outcome. The default is approved. Yeah, this works. All right, so I'm going to have a variable called outcome, and I'm going to do something with that variable. That happens right here. Let's go here and add an action, and this one is going to be start a list workflow. So I have to choose a 2010 list workflow. There aren't a lot. Here it is, declare current document as record. Do I have any parameters? No, there are no parameters, but you have to open that up and then click OK. Otherwise, you'll have an error that says you didn't configure that part. And then what are we going to manipulate? We're going to manipulate the current item. No output necessary. This is pretty much it. So it's 2 lines. Let's publish this thing. What did I forget to do? Oh, right. I have to go to end. With the new concept of stages, you actually always need to end this somehow.
Let's just go.
Yep, go to a stage. There's always a built-in stage called end of workflow. 3, 2, 1, and good. We're done. We're out of here. Let's run this thing. So it was really easy to run or to call another workflow. And if the workflow had startup parameters, I just would have supplied them inside of that list. I would have seen a dialog box with parameter, fill in the value, parameter, fill in the value, parameter, fill in the value. And realistically, that could happen all the time. Let's make sure this worked. We aren't doing cooking show tricks here. Let's try to eat that cake. Yes, let's try to eat that cake we just baked. So declare current document as record. No, 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 no. I don't want that. Record approval. That's what I want. Okay, now it's begun. Now we're looking at my laptop, but we're actually looking at a remote desktop window inside my laptop where I'm logged on as some fictional character named Eden Stafford. Well, I need to open up yet another remote desktop session in here where I am playing the role of the guy who has to approve this. His name is Brett Campbell. It's kind of like a window within a window within a window. It's like Inception. And if I open up here, I should see, oh, look, task assigned. Approve record declaration for non-disclosure agreement. Great. Let's open that up. And what am I presented with? Right now, I can just close it. I need to edit this in order to make a decision. And here are my options of approved or rejected or do whatever. So I'm going to choose approved. And we're done. Let's put this email account away. Let's put everything away. And come back here and refresh this page. And if everything went well, there we go. It is declared as an official record. Thank you very much. Tip your waitresses. Try the veal. Now, let's get back to slides and stuff. There are additional topics here that are worth pointing out. Thanks to the change in the architecture and change to advancements in SharePoint Designer, and thanks to a lot of changes in Project Server, you now have an additional set of actions if you are working inside of a project web app that allow you to design demand management workflows. It's for not just people that care about projects, but people that care about looking at several projects and people that look at the life cycle of all of those projects. So I think many of us care about run-of-the-mill projects. Some of us might want to put them in a centralized server. This is for the subset of that subset that cares about looking at all of them and looking at a common pool of resources and deciding which ones to allocate and which resources to put on them and doing postmortems and all of that. And it's a wonderful thing and everyone should do it. But the workflows we're talking about is a special case of workflow. If you work with Project Server, you know what demand management is. It's that. Whoops, I said all of that when we were looking at the picture. All right, let's move on. Visual Studio Development. There are a couple of ways to extend the parent. You're not limited by what you have in the box. If you are working with SharePoint Designer and trying to do workflows, there are options for adding things in that don't exist. Technique number one, call web services. In fact, the general suggestion is if you're going to write something new, make it a web service. That way it can be used by workflow, it can be used by lots of things. But if you really want it to be tightly coupled to workflow, you can create what's called a custom activity. And a custom activity could be declarative XML, or it could be code. But in both of those cases, you have to go to Visual Studio to create those. And then it'll show up as another action or another condition or another step or another something. But that works, and Visual Studio is also necessary if you want to package up a workflow in a proper app to be deployed to the SharePoint store and such, or the corporate catalog. And with that, we are done. Any questions?